Be honest. Have you ever walked into a room and forgotten why you went there? Struggled to stay focused on a simple task? Or caught yourself reading the same sentence over and over again? If that sounds familiar, you're not alone. Every day we're surrounded by notifications, endless information, and constant distractions. And without even noticing it, our ability to think clearly starts to fade. Most people assume they're just getting lazy, losing their edge, or simply not smart enough. But what if your brain doesn't need more talent? What if it just needs the right kind of training? In this audiobook, you'll discover simple techniques that can help you think faster, remember more, stay focused longer, and get more out of your mind without working harder. Stay until the end, because one small change in the way you use your brain could make a much bigger difference than you imagine. And before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new audiobooks. And now, let's begin. Introduction. A woman sits at her kitchen table at 7 in the morning. Her phone shows 43 unread notifications. 2 news alerts contradict each other. A colleague's email asks her to make a decision about a project she barely understands. Her teenager wants help evaluating a claim from social media. She has a performance review at 10. None of these situations came with instructions. All of them demand clear thinking, and she is not sure she has the tools to handle any of them well. This is not a rare morning, it is a typical one, and the gap it exposes between the cognitive demands of daily life and the tools most people have for meeting them is the reason this book exists. Intelligence is not a fixed quantity assigned at birth. It is a set of cognitive capacities that develop in response to how you use them. This is not speculation or optimism. Neuroscientist Michael Merzenich decades of research on brain plasticity demonstrated that the adult brain physically reorganizes itself in response to new learning and deliberate practice, forming new neural connections, strengthening useful pathways, and pruning unused ones. His work, along with converging evidence from laboratories around the world, established that this capacity for structural change persists throughout the entire human lifespan. The brain you carry today is not the brain you carried 5 years ago, and what you do with it from this point forward will shape the brain you carry 5 years from now. That fact has practical consequences, and those consequences are what this book is about. I am a psychologist and educator, and I have spent my career studying how people think and how they can think better. The methods in this book do not target IQ scores. Standardized intelligence tests measure a narrow band of cognitive performance under artificial conditions. They tell you very little about how effectively you reason through a workplace conflict, evaluate a financial decision, or recognize when someone is presenting a weak argument with confident delivery. This book trains the cognitive behaviors that produce better decisions, clearer reasoning, and more flexible thinking in the situations that actually matter. Not in a testing room, but in the rooms where you live and work. The program is built on 5 methods, each one grounded in established research from cognitive psychology and neuroscience. First, you will reactivate curiosity, the foundational drive that initiates all genuine learning. Second, you will develop critical thinking skills that protect your reasoning from bias and manipulation. Third, you will build a broader, more structured knowledge base that gives your mind richer material to work with. Fourth, you will strengthen your memory so that what you learn remains accessible when you need it. Fifth, you will sharpen your ability to solve real problems, the point where all 4 previous capacities converge and produce tangible results. A final chapter introduces 3 qualities: creativity, emotional intelligence, and social intelligence that accelerate every stage of this process. Each method builds on the one before it. The total time commitment is roughly 30 minutes a day, and the full sequence can be established within a single month. You do not need to return to formal education. You do not need unusual discipline or talent. You need a willingness to pay attention to how you think and to make small, deliberate adjustments to the habits that shape your mental life. I have seen these methods work with university students, with professionals in their 40s, and with retired adults in their 70s. The brain does not stop adapting when formal education ends. It stops adapting when you stop challenging it. By the end of this book, you will have a concrete daily practice for developing each of the 5 core dimensions of practical intelligence, and you will understand, from both the science and the experience of applying it, why that practice works. Chapter 1. Introduction to Understanding Intelligence. When he was 12, a boy in a mid-sized industrial city was told by his school counselor that his test results suggested he was better suited to vocational training than to an academic track. His parents accepted this assessment without question. So did he. For the next 20 years, he carried that label quietly, avoiding situations that might confirm it, skipping promotions that required analytical work, declining to speak in meetings where data was discussed, never reading anything more demanding than trade manuals. At 43, a restructuring at his company forced him into a planning role that required him to interpret financial reports and build forecasts. He expected to fail. Instead, over 8 months of consistent, structured practice, working through material slightly beyond his comfort level, asking questions when he didn't understand, reviewing what he'd learned at regular intervals, he became one of the more reliable analysts on his team. Not because some hidden talent had surfaced, because he had started doing the specific cognitive work he had spent decades avoiding. His story is a composite, drawn from dozens of similar cases I've encountered in my practice, and it illustrates the central claim of this chapter. Intelligence is not a permanent endowment. It is a set of cognitive capacities that respond to deliberate, sustained use. Before exploring the 5 methods that develop those capacities, we need to dismantle the beliefs that prevent most people from trying. 3 myths worth discarding. 3 myths about intelligence are especially widespread, and each one actively interferes with cognitive development. They operate not as conscious theories, but as background assumptions, unexamined beliefs that shape behavior without ever being stated aloud. The first myth is that IQ is genetic and essentially fixed, that you are born with a predetermined cognitive capacity, and no amount of effort will meaningfully change it. This belief draws superficial support from twin studies showing a heritable component to intelligence. But heritability describes variation within a population under specific conditions. It does not mean that any individual's cognitive abilities are locked in place. A landmark study published in Nature tracked adolescents over several years and found that their IQ scores changed substantially in both directions, with corresponding structural changes visible in brain imaging. The scores moved because the brains themselves were physically changing in response to experience. Genetics set a starting range, not a ceiling, and that range is far wider than most people assume. The second myth is that intelligence peaks at a certain age, typically somewhere in the mid-20s, and then declines irreversibly. While it is true that certain forms of processing speed slow with age, crystallized intelligence, the accumulated store of knowledge, vocabulary, and reasoning strategies built through experience, continues to grow well into later life. Many of the most sophisticated thinkers in any field are not the youngest, but the most experienced, precisely because they have had decades to build the knowledge networks that support complex reasoning. The assumption that cognitive decline is inevitable and uniform is not supported by the evidence. What declines without intervention is the habit of challenging the brain with new demands, and that habit is entirely within your control. The third myth is that genuinely intelligent people don't have to work hard, that real ability is effortless, and that struggle is a sign of inadequacy. This is perhaps the most damaging belief of all, because it causes people to interpret normal difficulty as evidence of limitation rather than as evidence of learning. Research in expertise development has shown the opposite. High performers in virtually every domain engage in more deliberate, effortful practice than their peers, not less. Concert pianists practice more than casual players, not because they need to, but because that is how their ability was built in the first place. Struggle is not a symptom of low ability. It is the mechanism by which ability develops. What matters is not whether the work feels easy, but whether you have the right method and the right environment to support your effort. How thinking actually changes. If intelligence were truly fixed, none of the methods in this book would work. But the science of neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to reorganize itself by forming new neural connections in response to learning and experience, tells a different story. Cognitive skill development is supported by the brain's structural adaptability throughout the lifespan. This does not mean that anyone can dramatically raise a standardized test score through willpower alone. It means that the specific cognitive behaviors that produce clear thinking, asking precise questions, evaluating evidence, connecting ideas across domains, retaining and applying what you've learned, are all trainable through deliberate practice. Psychologist Carol Dweck, in her 2006 book Mindset, introduced a framework that captures how beliefs about intelligence shape behavior. People who hold what Dweck calls a fixed mindset tend to interpret difficulty as a signal that they've reached their limit. They avoid challenges, withdraw from tasks where failure is possible, and treat mistakes as confirmation of inadequacy. A student with a fixed mindset who receives a poor grade on a math exam concludes, "I'm not a math person," and reduces effort in future math courses. People who hold a growth mindset, the belief that cognitive abilities can be developed through effort, strategy, and learning, respond differently. They seek out challenges, they persist through difficulty. They treat errors as diagnostic information rather than as final verdicts. A student with a growth mindset who receives the same poor grade asks, "What did I misunderstand and how do I study differently next time?" Dweck's research demonstrated that when students were taught about brain plasticity and helped to adopt a growth orientation, their academic performance improved measurably, including in subjects where they had previously struggled. It is worth noting that large-scale replications of Dweck's original findings found smaller average effect sizes than the early studies reported, particularly for general populations. The benefits appear most pronounced among individuals facing specific disadvantages or transitional challenges. The framework remains practically useful, but it is not a universal lever, and a book about critical thinking should be transparent about that distinction. The conclusion drawn from these converging lines of evidence is straightforward. Effort matters, but effort alone is not sufficient. Method and environment matter just as much. Intelligence is dynamic. It grows where a person commits to deliberate cognitive work, uses effective strategies, and operates in conditions that support genuine learning. It stagnates where none of those conditions are met, regardless of how much raw potential exists. The habit that starts everything. So, what does deliberate cognitive work actually look like in daily life? It does not look like cramming, and it does not look like passively absorbing content. It looks like consistently engaging with material that is slightly beyond your current level of understanding. Not so far beyond that you're lost, but far enough that you have to work to make sense of it. This means choosing a book that challenges you, rather than one that confirms what you already know. It means sitting with a concept you don't fully grasp and spending 15 minutes trying to understand it rather than skipping ahead. It means reviewing what you learned yesterday before consuming something new today. It means writing down your understanding in your own words, noticing where the gaps are, and going back to fill them. This kind of engagement is qualitatively different from scrolling through articles or watching short videos. Those activities produce the feeling of learning without much of the substance. Deliberate learning is slower, less comfortable, and far more effective. It is the difference between watching someone else exercise and doing the workout yourself. And like physical exercise, the results are not visible after a single session. They accumulate through repetition, through consistency, and through the willingness to keep showing up when progress feels invisible. The 5 methods in this book are all forms of deliberate cognitive practice, each targeting a different dimension of thinking. The first, and the one that makes all the others possible, is curiosity. Not curiosity as a vague personality trait, but curiosity as a specific, trainable habit, the practice of noticing what you don't understand and choosing to pursue it rather than pass it by. That habit is the subject of the next chapter, and it is where your practical work begins. Chapter 2. Method 1. Developing Curiosity. A data analyst I worked with, 10 years into his career at a financial services firm, described a moment that unsettled him. He was sitting in a quarterly strategy meeting, listening to a presentation about a new risk model, and he realized he had no questions. Not because he understood the model fully, but because he had stopped caring how things worked. He knew enough to do his job. He read the same 3 industry publications he'd been reading for years. He hadn't picked up a book outside his field in over a decade. When colleagues raised unfamiliar ideas, his first instinct was to categorize them as relevant or irrelevant and move on. He told me he couldn't remember the last time he'd been genuinely surprised by something he'd learned. This man was not unintelligent. He was cognitively comfortable, and that comfort was quietly narrowing his thinking in ways he hadn't noticed until the narrowing became impossible to ignore. His questions at meetings had declined from an average of 4 or 5 per session to 0. His reading had contracted to a single domain. His conversations at work had become entirely transactional. He was, by every external measure, performing well, and by every internal measure his mind was running on a smaller and smaller track. His situation is not unusual. It is, in fact, the default trajectory for most adults who do not deliberately counteract it. And counteracting it begins with understanding why it happens in the first place. Why curiosity matters to the brain. Curiosity is not merely a pleasant feeling or a character trait that some people happen to possess. It is a cognitive state with measurable neurological effects. When you become genuinely curious about something, when a question captures your attention and you feel a pull toward finding out the answer, your brain responds in specific, well-documented ways. A 2014 study by Gruber, Gelman, and Ranganath, published in Neuron, found that states of curiosity were associated with increased activity in the brain's dopamine-driven reward pathways and in the hippocampus, a region critical to memory formation. Participants who were in a curious state when exposed to new information retained that information significantly better, and remarkably they also showed improved memory for unrelated information presented during the same period. Curiosity, in other words, doesn't just help you learn the thing you're curious about. It creates a neurochemical environment in which your brain becomes temporarily better at learning in general. This is why curiosity matters so much as a foundation for the other methods in this book. When you approach material in a state of genuine interest, your encoding is deeper. your retention is stronger, and your ability to connect new information to existing knowledge is enhanced. When you approach the same material in a state of indifference or obligation, the biological infrastructure that supports deep learning is barely activated. The information passes through working memory and largely disappears. The difference between these two states, curiosity and indifference, is not a matter of motivation or willpower. It is a difference in brain chemistry that produces measurably different learning outcomes. Curiosity does not directly raise cognitive test scores. What it does is support the quality of learning, and sustained, high-quality learning is what drives cognitive growth over time. Why curiosity shrinks with age. If curiosity is so neurologically powerful, why does it decline so reliably in most adults? Three forces are primarily responsible, and each one operates quietly enough that most people never notice what's being lost. The first is social conformity pressure. In most professional environments, asking basic questions carries a social cost. The person who says, "I don't understand, can you explain that?" risks appearing uninformed or slow. Over time, most people learn to nod along, to project comprehension, and to look things up later if they must. Except they rarely do look things up later. The moment passes. The question dies. A senior accountant I worked with told me she hadn't asked a clarifying question in a meeting in over 3 years, not because she understood everything, but because the culture in her firm treated questions as a sign of insufficient preparation. The second force is time scarcity, or, more precisely, the perception of time scarcity. When your schedule is full, curiosity feels like a diversion. Following an unfamiliar thread of thought when you have deadlines, responsibilities, and a list of things that need doing right now feels irresponsible, even self-indulgent. The result is that curiosity gets classified as a leisure activity rather than as a cognitive necessity, and it gets cut from the schedule the same way exercise or sleep often get cut. First occasionally, then habitually, then permanently. What is lost in this process is not just interesting knowledge, but the neurological benefits of the curious state itself, benefits that would improve performance on the very tasks that seem too urgent to interrupt. The third force is the habit of certainty. The longer you spend in a field, the more confident you become in your existing models of how things work. That confidence is often well-earned. Experience does produce genuine expertise, but it also produces a diminishing appetite for information that might complicate or contradict what you already believe. You stop seeking out perspectives that challenge your assumptions because your assumptions feel settled. The world narrows not because it has become less interesting, but because you have become less interested. And because this narrowing happens gradually, a few fewer questions each year, a few fewer unfamiliar books, a few fewer conversations outside your usual circle. It is nearly invisible until it has become deeply entrenched. Each of these forces is reversible, but reversing them requires specific, repeatable practices, not vague intentions to be more curious. 4 techniques for rebuilding curiosity. Technique 1. Apply the 5 whys to one ordinary situation each day. Choose something routine, a process at work, a habit at home, a policy you've always followed, and ask why it exists, then ask why again about the answer you get. Repeat at least 5 times. A project manager I know applied this to his team's weekly status meeting, and, by the 4th why, realized that the meeting existed to serve a reporting requirement that had been eliminated 2 years earlier. The meeting was still happening out of pure inertia. The 5 whys does not require special knowledge. It requires only the willingness to keep pushing past the first adequate-sounding answer. Spend 5 minutes on this exercise once per day, and within a week you will notice how many things in your environment exist without a current reason. Technique 2. Read one article per week from a field entirely outside your professional domain. Choose deliberately: astrophysics if you work in marketing, sociology if you work in engineering, agricultural science if you work in finance. Spend 20 minutes with the article. You will not understand all of it. That is the point. The discomfort of partial comprehension is the neurological signal that your brain is being asked to form new connections. Do not attempt to master the material. Attempt only to identify one idea, one term, or one framework that you had not previously encountered. Over time, these weekly excursions build a broader base of reference points that feed directly into the knowledge-building and problem-solving methods discussed in later chapters. The investment is 20 minutes per week. The returns are cumulative and often surprising in their applications. Technique 3. Keep a question log. Before bed each evening, write down 3 questions that arose during the day. Things you noticed but didn't investigate, concepts you heard but didn't understand, decisions you observed but couldn't explain. Do not answer the questions, just record them. Review the log once a week and choose one question to spend 15 minutes researching. The act of writing questions trains your attention to notice them during the day. Within 2 or 3 weeks, most people report that they are generating questions more frequently and more naturally, not because they are trying harder, but because their attention has shifted. The question log takes 3 minutes each evening and 15 minutes once per week. It is the lowest cost, highest impact practice in this chapter. Technique 4. Spend 10 minutes each week in conversation with someone whose professional field is entirely different from yours. This can be a colleague in another department, a neighbor, a friend from a different industry. Ask them what problem they are currently working on and listen without offering solutions. Ask follow-up questions aimed at understanding their reasoning, not at demonstrating your own knowledge. These conversations expose you to frameworks, vocabularies, and problem-solving approaches that you would never encounter within your own domain. They are also, consistently, more interesting than most people expect, because genuine curiosity about how another person thinks tends to produce richer and more engaging exchanges than conversations in which both parties are performing expertise. From questions to answers. Curiosity, practiced consistently through specific daily and weekly habits, does something that no amount of passive information consumption can achieve. It transforms your relationship with what you do not know. Instead of treating unfamiliarity as a gap to be concealed or a detour to be avoided, you begin treating it as the starting point of genuine learning. That shift, from avoidance to active pursuit, is what keeps cognitive development alive across an entire lifespan. It is the difference between a mind that is still growing and a mind that has settled into comfortable repetition. But curiosity alone is not enough. A curious mind generates questions constantly. Some of those questions lead to reliable knowledge. Others lead to misinformation, to appealing but unsupported claims, to conclusions that feel right but aren't. The ability to distinguish between these, to evaluate the answers that curiosity produces, is a separate cognitive skill, and it is the subject of the next chapter. Once you know how to ask good questions, the next step is learning which answers to trust. Chapter 3. Method 2. Developing critical thinking skills. You open your phone over breakfast and see a headline: Major study links coffee to increased heart disease risk. It references a large observational study, hundreds of thousands of participants, published in a recognizable journal. Your stomach tightens, you drink 3 cups a day. You scroll further and within minutes encounter a second headline. New research confirms coffee drinkers live longer, have healthier hearts. This article also cites a large study, also published in a credible journal, also based on an impressive sample size. 2 claims, both presented with authority, both apparently backed by evidence, and they directly contradict each other. Most people at this point do something predictable. They believe the one that aligns with what they already want to be true. The coffee lover accepts the second headline. The person already anxious about their health latches onto the first. Neither reads the original study. Neither asks whether the 2 studies used different methodologies, one observational, tracking correlations across a population, the other controlling for confounding variables like exercise, smoking, and diet. That would explain the discrepancy entirely. Neither pauses long enough to notice that the headlines were written not by the researchers but by journalists optimizing for clicks. This is what happens when you encounter competing claims without a reliable process for evaluating them. And in an environment where claims compete constantly without quality control, where algorithms reward engagement over accuracy and repetition substitutes for evidence, it happens dozens of times a day on topics far more consequential than coffee. It happens with medical decisions, financial choices, political judgments, and professional assessments. Each time it happens without a filtering process, the quality of your thinking degrades slightly, and those slight degradations accumulate. Critical thinking is that reliable process. It is not a philosophy, and it does not require specialized academic training. It is a learnable, repeatable habit, the habit of pausing before accepting a claim and asking 3 specific questions. The 3-question checklist. The first question: what is the source? Not who shared the claim on social media, but where it originally came from. A peer-reviewed journal carries different weight than a press release. A government statistical agency operates under different standards than an advocacy organization. A company-funded study has different incentive structures than an independent replication. Identifying the actual source takes 30 seconds and eliminates a significant proportion of unreliable information before any deeper analysis is needed. Most people never take this step. They evaluate claims based on where they encountered them, not on where the claims originated. The second question: what is the evidence? Does the claim rest on a controlled study, an anecdotal report, a single expert's opinion, or someone's personal authority? How large was the sample? Was the study designed to establish causation, or only to observe correlation? Has the finding been replicated by independent researchers? In the coffee example, one study was observational. It tracked correlations across a large population, but could not establish that coffee itself caused the observed health differences. The other controlled for variables like exercise, diet, and smoking, producing a more precise, though still not definitive, picture. Understanding this single distinction between correlation and causation resolves the apparent contradiction almost entirely, and yet most people never learn to ask which type of evidence they are looking at. The third question: what is the alternative explanation? For any striking claim, ask what else could account for the finding. If a company reports that users of its product are more successful, could it be that successful people were more likely to buy the product in the first place? If a politician claims that crime rose after a policy was enacted, could the increase have begun before the policy took effect? If a health influencer claims that a supplement cured their chronic fatigue, could the improvement be attributable to the placebo effect, to other lifestyle changes made at the same time, or simply to the natural fluctuation of symptoms? This question alone, what else could explain this, defeats a remarkable number of misleading arguments. These 3 questions form a portable, reusable tool. They work on news articles, workplace presentations, medical advice, advertisements, and casual claims made in conversation. They do not require you to become an expert in every field. They require only the discipline to pause for 60 seconds before accepting what you've been told. With practice, the pause becomes automatic, a brief internal checkpoint that operates before your mind commits to a conclusion. A clarification is important here. Skepticism is not cynicism. Skepticism tests claims. It asks for evidence, looks for alternative explanations, and withholds judgment until the reasoning is clear. Cynicism dismisses claims. It assumes bad faith, rejects information reflexively, and substitutes suspicion for analysis. The first sharpens thinking. The second shuts it down. Everything in this chapter aims at the first. The goal is not to trust less, but to trust more accurately, to direct your confidence toward claims that have earned it and away from those that have not. 3. Manipulation traps. Beyond the 3-question checklist, it helps to recognize the specific techniques most commonly used to bypass analytical thinking. 3 are especially prevalent in daily life, and once you learn to identify them, you will encounter them everywhere. In advertising, in political discourse, in workplace arguments, and even in conversations with people you trust. The first is emotional framing, the practice of presenting information in a way designed to trigger fear, outrage, or moral urgency before you have time to evaluate the underlying claim. A news segment that opens with alarming music and dramatic imagery before presenting any data is using emotional framing. A fundraising email that leads with a heartbreaking individual story before asking for a donation to a program whose effectiveness has never been measured is using emotional framing. The emotional response arrives first and shapes how you interpret everything that follows. The counter is straightforward. When you feel a strong emotional reaction to a claim, treat that reaction as a signal to slow down, not to speed up. The stronger the feeling, the more carefully the evidence deserves to be examined. Emotions are not irrelevant. They carry real information about what matters to you. But they should inform your analysis, not replace it. The second is false authority, citing credentials or status that do not actually apply to the claim being made. A Nobel Prize-winning physicist endorsing an economic policy is not lending scientific credibility to that policy. Expertise in one domain does not transfer automatically to another. A celebrity recommending a medical treatment is offering personal testimony, not clinical evidence. A successful entrepreneur offering advice on parenting is drawing on personal experience, not professional expertise. The relevant question is never, is this person impressive? It is, does this person have demonstrated expertise in the specific subject they are speaking about? When the answer is no, their opinion carries no more weight than anyone else's, regardless of their fame, wealth, or accomplishments in other areas. The third is the false binary, presenting a situation as though only 2 options exist when, in reality, many are available. You're either with us or against us is the classic form, but subtler versions appear constantly in workplace discussions, political debates, and personal decisions. We either launch the product now or lose the market entirely, omits options like a limited release, a revised timeline, or a pilot program. Either you trust me or you don't, omits the possibility that trust can be partial, conditional, or context-dependent. Whenever a claim presents exactly 2 choices, ask what has been excluded. The answer is usually the most interesting and most useful part of the analysis. 3. Activation practices. Recognizing these patterns is useful. Practicing recognition is what makes it reliable. 3 exercises, each designed to be repeated weekly, build the critical thinking habit systematically. Like the curiosity practices in the previous chapter, these are not abstract principles. They are timed, repeatable actions with specific instructions. Exercise 1. Assumption Mapping. Choose one news article per week, any topic, any source. Spend 10 minutes reading it carefully, then write down every assumption the article makes without stating explicitly. A report claiming that remote workers are less productive assumes a specific definition of productivity, assumes the measurement method is valid, assumes the comparison group is equivalent, and assumes that the factors being measured are the ones that matter most. You are not trying to debunk the article. You are training yourself to see the scaffolding behind any argument, the unstated premises that the conclusion depends on. 10 minutes, once a week, with a pen and paper. Over time, this practice makes the hidden structure of arguments visible in real time, even when you are not deliberately looking for it. Exercise 2. Argue the opposite. Before making any significant decision, at work, in a personal matter, in a disagreement, spend 5 minutes constructing the strongest possible case against your own position. Not a caricature, not a straw man, but the most reasonable, evidence-based version of the opposing view you can manage. Write it down or speak it out loud. This practice is uncomfortable by design. The discomfort is evidence that you are engaging with your own assumptions rather than protecting them. 5 minutes applied to one decision per week. If you cannot construct a reasonable opposing argument, that is important diagnostic information. It may mean the decision is genuinely clear, or it may mean you do not yet understand the opposing perspective well enough to evaluate your own position honestly. Exercise 3. The 24-hour delay. When you encounter a new and striking claim, a political assertion, a health recommendation, a dramatic statistic, deliberately withhold your opinion for 24 hours. Do not share the claim. Do not form a conclusion. Do not discuss it with others or post about it. The next day, revisit the claim and apply the 3-question checklist: source, evidence, alternative explanation. You will consistently find that the urgency you felt in the first moment has faded, and your analysis in the second moment is sharper, more balanced, and more honest. This exercise costs no additional time at all. It simply redistributes the time you would have spent reacting into time spent evaluating. The quality difference between an immediate reaction and a delayed evaluation is, in most cases, substantial. And the discipline of waiting, of tolerating the discomfort of not having an opinion for 24 hours, is itself a form of cognitive training that strengthens your capacity for deliberate reasoning over reactive judgment. The foundation beneath analysis. Critical thinking is not about having all the answers. It is about having a consistent, honest process for evaluating the answers that come your way. It protects your reasoning from comfortable illusions, from deliberate manipulation, and from the conclusions drawn before checking the evidence, the conclusions that feel right precisely because they were never examined. But critical thinking requires material to work with. A well-honed analytical process operating on a thin base of knowledge produces confident conclusions about very little. The depth and breadth of what you know determines the range and quality of what you can analyze, and the richness of the connections you can draw between ideas from different domains. The next chapter addresses this directly: how to build a knowledge base that gives your critical thinking something substantial and structured to operate on. By the way, it would be interesting to know your opinion. Do you agree with the author's point of view? If you agree with this idea, write the word "agree" in the comments. Chapter 4. Method 3. Expanding the knowledge base. 2 operations managers at competing logistics companies face the same problem: Last-mile delivery costs are rising faster than revenue. The first manager, deeply experienced in logistics but narrowly read, responds with the tools she knows: renegotiating carrier contracts, optimizing route software, tightening delivery windows. These are sensible moves, and they produce modest savings. The second manager has been reading about behavioral economics in his adjacent reading time. He recognizes that a significant portion of the cost spike comes from failed first-attempt deliveries, and he recalls a concept from behavioral research: default bias. He redesigns the customer notification system so that the default option is a confirmed 2-hour delivery window that customers must actively change, rather than an open window they passively ignore. First attempt delivery success rises by 22%. Costs drop accordingly. Both managers are intelligent, but the second one had access to a framework from outside his field that the first one simply did not possess. That framework, not superior reasoning ability, is what produced the better solution. This is the argument of this chapter in a single scene. The quality of your thinking depends directly on the breadth and structure of what you know. Curiosity generates questions. Critical thinking evaluates answers. But both require raw material to work with, and that material is knowledge. Information is not knowledge. Before discussing how to build a knowledge base, it is worth making a distinction that most people skip. Information and knowledge are not the same thing. Information is raw input, a statistic, a headline, a data point encountered in passing. You might read that global lithium production increased by 14% last year. That is information. It enters your awareness and, in most cases, leaves again within hours because it is connected to nothing else in your understanding. Knowledge is what information becomes when it is integrated into a structure you already possess. If you understand something about battery technology, electric vehicle supply chains, and geopolitical competition over mineral resources, that lithium statistic connects to a network of existing ideas. It becomes meaningful. You can reason with it, draw inferences from it, and use it to anticipate developments you haven't yet read about. The same data point, 14%, is inert in one mind and generative in another, depending entirely on what it has to attach to. This distinction matters because most people's learning efforts produce information, not knowledge. They consume large quantities of content, articles, videos, podcasts, social media posts, and come away with a vague sense of being informed. But very little of what they consumed has been connected to anything they already understand, which means very little of it is retrievable, applicable, or useful for reasoning. The feeling of learning and the reality of learning are two different things, and the gap between them is where most intellectual effort is wasted. Research on analogical reasoning has consistently shown that people who possess knowledge across multiple domains generate more creative solutions to novel problems than those with equivalent depth in a single domain. The mechanism is not mysterious. Cross-domain knowledge provides more structural templates for recognizing patterns, and pattern recognition across unfamiliar contexts is precisely what creative problem-solving requires. The practical implication is clear. If you want to think better, you need to build broader, not just deeper. A 3-tier reading system. The most common advice about knowledge building is some variation of read more. This is well-intentioned but operationally useless. Read more of what? For how long? In what proportion? Without a structure, most people either read exclusively within their comfort zone or consume widely, but shallowly, retaining little of either. What is needed is a system that balances depth, adjacency, and surprise, and that specifies how much time each tier requires. I recommend a 3-tier system that works with books, but it works equally well with long-form articles, documented lecture series, and structured online courses. The format matters less than the depth of engagement. The first tier is core reading. This is material in your primary professional or intellectual field, the domain where you already have the most knowledge, and where depth pays the highest immediate dividends. Commit to one book or equivalent long-form resource per month in this area. This is not casual browsing. It is focused engagement with serious material that pushes your understanding beyond its current boundary. A financial analyst reading a new text on valuation methodology. A teacher reading current research on cognitive load theory. A software engineer reading a book on distributed systems architecture. The goal is to keep your deepest knowledge area genuinely current and continuously deepening, so that your expertise remains a living, growing structure rather than a static credential. The second tier is adjacent reading. This is material from a field that borders your own, close enough to be relevant, far enough to introduce unfamiliar frameworks. One book or equivalent per quarter is sufficient. An engineer reading about organizational psychology, a therapist reading about decision science, a marketing director reading about statistics. Adjacent reading builds the bridges between domains that allow you to transfer insights from one context to another. It is where you develop the ability to see that a problem in your field has structural similarities to a problem that has already been solved in a neighboring field. An ability that produces some of the most practically valuable thinking available to any professional. The third tier is wildcard reading. This is one short text per month, an article, an essay, a chapter, from a field that has no obvious connection to your work or primary interests. Evolutionary biology if you work in marketing. Architectural theory if you work in medicine. Maritime history if you work in software. Musicology if you work in finance. This tier is the smallest in volume and the highest in density of unexpected connections. It is where the logistics manager encounters behavioral economics. It is where a psychologist discovers structural engineering metaphors that reshape how she thinks about anxiety. Wildcard reading is not a luxury or an indulgence. It is the tier that most reliably produces the kind of cross-domain insight that distinguishes flexible thinkers from narrowly competent ones. The investment is 15 to 20 minutes per month. The returns are disproportionate. One point deserves emphasis here. The three tiers are not rigid prescriptions. Some months, your core reading will naturally overlap with adjacent territory. Some wildcard articles will turn out to be surprisingly relevant to your professional work. The value of the system is not in the boundaries between tiers, but in the discipline of maintaining all three simultaneously. Most people, left to their own habits, read exclusively in the first tier, core material within their existing field. The system's purpose is to ensure that the second and third tiers don't disappear, because they are the ones most likely to be neglected and most likely to produce the connections that make your thinking genuinely original. Note-taking as a processing protocol. Reading without processing is consumption without construction. The knowledge that actually enhances your thinking is knowledge you have actively worked with, not merely encountered. Most people finish a chapter or an article and move on, trusting that the important parts will stick. Memory research, as we will see in the next chapter, shows that this trust is badly misplaced. Without active processing, most of what you read will be functionally gone within a week. I recommend a specific processing protocol that takes no more than 5 minutes after any focused reading session. It is not journaling, and it is not summarizing for the sake of recording. It is a structured act of cognitive integration designed to transform information into knowledge. First, write 3 sentences summarizing what you just read. Use your own words. Do not copy phrases from the text. If you cannot produce 3 sentences, you did not understand the material well enough, and that is useful information in itself. It tells you exactly where to direct your attention when you return to the material. Second, write 1 sentence connecting what you read to something you already know. This is where isolated information becomes networked knowledge. The connection can be an analogy, a contradiction, a parallel, or an application. This concept of default bias is similar to the anchoring effect I read about in the critical thinking chapter. Both describe how initial framing shapes subsequent decisions. The specific content of the connection matters less than the act of making one. Each connection you build creates an additional retrieval pathway in memory and an additional reasoning pathway in thought. Third, write 1 open question that the reading generated. Something you don't yet know, something that doesn't quite fit, something you want to investigate further. This question feeds directly back into the curiosity practice from Chapter 2. It keeps your learning oriented forward rather than simply accumulating backward, and it ensures that each reading session generates not just knowledge, but direction, a thread to follow next. This 5-minute protocol transforms passive reading into active knowledge construction. It is the difference between filling a container and building a structure. Containers hold what you pour into them and nothing more. Structures support weight. They allow you to build higher, reach further, and bear loads that would collapse an unconnected collection of facts. Over the course of several months, the accumulated 5-minute sessions produce a written record of your intellectual development that is itself a valuable resource, a map of connections and questions that reveals how your thinking has grown and where it might profitably go next. Avoiding overload. A common response to the advice, build a broader knowledge base, is to attempt to read everything, to subscribe to 12 newsletters, download 40 podcasts, and stack books on every surface. This approach fails reliably because it confuses volume with retention. The goal is not to maximize input. The goal is to maximize the amount of input that becomes genuinely integrated, retrievable knowledge. Knowledge you can actually use when a situation demands it. A realistic weekly time budget for focused knowledge building is 4 hours. This is not 4 hours of scrolling or skimming. It is 4 hours of engaged reading or listening, followed by the 5-minute processing protocol described above. That pace, roughly 30 to 40 minutes per day, is sustainable for most working adults and sufficient to complete 1 core book per month, 1 adjacent book per quarter, and 1 wildcard article per month. More than this is welcome but not necessary. Consistency matters more than volume, and a reader who processes 4 hours of material thoroughly will retain and use far more than a reader who skims for 12. On a Monday morning, this looks concrete. 30 minutes of focused reading before starting work or during a lunch break, followed by 5 minutes of writing, 3 summary sentences, 1 connection, 1 question. That is the entire system. It is repeatable, it is portable, and it produces cumulative results that become visible within weeks, as you begin noticing connections between ideas that would previously have remained isolated in separate mental compartments. I want to add 1 caution here because I have seen it undermine otherwise excellent learning habits. Do not measure your progress by the number of books finished. Measure it by the number of genuine connections made. Connections that change how you think about a problem, how you interpret an event, or how you approach a decision. A single book read deeply and processed thoroughly, with every chapter connected to your existing knowledge base, is worth more than 10 books skimmed and forgotten. The 3-tier system is designed to optimize for connection density, not for volume. Keep that distinction in mind, especially during weeks when your reading pace feels slow. Slow reading with active processing is fast learning. Fast reading without processing is not learning at all. From knowledge to retention. A structured, well-connected knowledge base transforms the quality of your reasoning. It gives your critical thinking substantive material to analyze. It feeds your curiosity with new threads to follow. It provides your problem-solving with frameworks and analogies drawn from multiple domains. But all of this depends on a condition that most people take for granted, and that most people fail to meet. The knowledge must actually stay in your memory long enough to be useful. How memory works, why it fails, and what you can do to make it reliable is the subject of the next chapter. Chapter 5. Method 4. Improving Memory. 3 weeks ago, a financial consultant I work with read a book on negotiation strategy. She found it genuinely useful. She highlighted passages, nodded along, and finished it feeling like she had gained something valuable. Then, at a client meeting 2 weeks later, the conversation turned to a contract renegotiation. She reached mentally for the framework she'd read about, the one that had seemed so clear and applicable at the time, and found almost nothing. She could remember that the book existed. She could recall that she'd liked it. But the specific model, the 3-step process she had highlighted and mentally noted as important, was gone. She sat in that meeting and improvised, knowing that somewhere in a book on her nightstand was a better approach she could no longer access. This experience is not a sign of poor memory. It is a sign of normal memory. Memory operating exactly as it does when no deliberate retention effort has been made. And it is the reason this chapter exists. Memory is not a passive trait you are born with at a fixed capacity. It is a trainable process, and training it changes the quality of everything else this book has been building toward. Without reliable memory, the knowledge you built in Chapter 4 fades before it can serve your critical thinking from Chapter 3, and the questions generated by your curiosity practice from Chapter 2 lead to insights that evaporate before they can be applied. How memory works. 3 types of memory matter most for intellectual performance, and understanding the difference between them clarifies why most people's retention efforts fail. The first is working memory, the small mental workspace where you hold and manipulate information in the moment. When you are following a spoken argument, doing arithmetic in your head, or trying to keep track of several points during a meeting, you are using working memory. Its capacity is far more limited than most people realize. George Miller's well-known 1956 estimate of 7 items, plus or minus 2, has been revised downward by subsequent research. Nelson Cowan's work, now broadly accepted in cognitive science, places the effective capacity of working memory at approximately 4 chunks of information. Items held in working memory fade within seconds if they are not actively rehearsed. This is not a deficiency. It is a design constraint of the system, one that has profound implications for how you should approach learning, note-taking, and problem-solving, as we discussed in the previous chapter's processing protocol. The second is long-term declarative memory, the store of facts, concepts, events, and relationships that you can consciously recall. This is where the negotiation framework from that book would live if it had been encoded properly. Declarative memory is vast and, under the right conditions, remarkably durable. Its primary limitation is not capacity but encoding quality. Information that enters through shallow processing, skimming, passive reading, half-attentive listening, forms weak memory traces that degrade within hours or days. Information that enters through deep, effortful processing, the kind of processing the 5-minute protocol from Chapter 4 is designed to produce, forms stronger traces that can persist for months or years with appropriate reinforcement. The third is procedural memory, the store of how-to patterns and skills that operate largely below conscious awareness. riding a bicycle, typing without looking at the keyboard, navigating a familiar software interface. These are procedural memories. They are acquired through repetition and practice, rather than through study, and once established, they tend to be highly resistant to forgetting. Procedural memory matters for intellectual development because the thinking habits you build through the methods in this book, asking critical questions, connecting new information to existing knowledge, applying the four-step problem-solving framework, eventually become procedural. They shift from deliberate effort to automatic practice. That transition is the point at which cognitive development becomes self-sustaining rather than effortful, and it typically occurs after several weeks of consistent daily practice. The critical bottleneck for most people is the transfer of information from working memory into long-term declarative memory. That transfer depends on the quality of encoding, how deeply and actively you process the information during your initial encounter with it. 3 specific research-supported techniques target this bottleneck directly. 3 techniques for stronger encoding. Spaced repetition is the practice of reviewing material at systematically increasing intervals rather than in a single, concentrated session. Instead of reading a chapter once and moving on, you revisit the key concepts after 1 day, then after 3 days, then after 7 days, then after 21 days. Each successful recall at a longer interval strengthens the memory trace and signals to the brain that this information is worth retaining. Research on spaced repetition spans more than a century, and the results are among the most consistent in cognitive psychology. Spaced review significantly improves retention rates compared to massed study of the same duration. It does not guarantee permanent encoding, no technique does, but it produces retention rates that are dramatically higher than any alternative approach. The technique is most effective when systematized. Digital tools such as Anki, a free flashcard application that automatically schedules reviews based on your performance, reduce the organizational burden to near zero. You spend 5 to 10 minutes per day reviewing cards the system presents to you at optimal intervals. For professionals, the content might be key concepts from their field, vocabulary from a language they are learning, or frameworks from books they want to retain. The daily time cost is minimal. The cumulative retention advantage over unsystematic review is substantial. If you read a book using the processing protocol from Chapter 4 and then enter your key takeaways into a spaced repetition system, you will retain more from that single book than most people retain from 10 books read passively. The Feynman technique, named after the physicist Richard Feynman, targets a different failure mode, the illusion of understanding. The method is straightforward. After reading or studying a concept, close the source material and explain the concept in plain language, as if teaching it to a 12-year-old. Use no jargon. Use no shorthand. If you reach a point where your explanation becomes vague, circular, or dependent on technical terms you cannot define, that is the precise location of a gap in your understanding. Return to the source material, study the gap specifically, and then attempt the explanation again. Repeat until you can walk through the concept clearly from beginning to end without hedging. This process typically takes 10 to 15 minutes per concept and should be applied to any material you consider important enough to retain. It is uncomfortable because it exposes exactly how much of what felt like understanding was actually recognition, the same distinction we encountered in the previous chapter's discussion of passive reading versus active processing. Recognition feels like knowledge. Retrieval proves whether it actually is. Retrieval practice is the act of actively reconstructing information from memory rather than passively reviewing it. Instead of rereading your notes or highlights, close the book and write down everything you can remember. Then check what you missed. The effort of attempted recall, even when it feels uncertain or incomplete, strengthens the memory trace more effectively than any amount of rereading. This is counterintuitive for most people, who believe that the best way to learn something is to study it repeatedly. In fact, the best way to learn something is to study it once with full attention and then practice retrieving it from memory multiple times. Apply retrieval practice immediately after any focused reading or learning session. Spend 5 minutes writing down the main points without consulting the source. Then review what you missed and note those gaps for your next spaced repetition cycle. Repeat this process 2 to 3 times per week for material you are actively learning. The combination of retrieval practice and spaced repetition is the highest return investment available for long-term retention, and the two techniques reinforce each other directly. Retrieval practice strengthens the memories that spaced repetition schedules for review, and spaced repetition ensures that retrieval practice happens at the intervals most beneficial for consolidation. 3 habits that support the system. Techniques operate within a biological context, and 3 daily habits determine whether that context supports or undermines your memory. These are not optional enhancements. They are the physiological infrastructure on which all memory techniques depend. The first is consistent sleep, 7 to 8 hours per night. During sleep, particularly during deep slow-wave sleep and REM stages, the brain consolidates memories by transferring information from temporary hippocampal storage into more permanent cortical networks. Research from Matthew Walker's laboratory at UC Berkeley has demonstrated that a single night of inadequate sleep can reduce memory consolidation efficiency by up to 40%. Sleep is not a recovery period that follows learning. It is a phase of the learning process itself, and skipping it is equivalent to completing the first 3/4 of a workout and then undoing the results. If you are serious about retaining what you learn, and if you are investing 4 hours per week in the reading system from Chapter 4, then protecting your sleep is not a lifestyle preference. It is a prerequisite for that investment to produce returns. The second is physical exercise, a minimum of 20 minutes, at least 3 times per week. Regular aerobic activity increases blood flow to the brain, stimulates the growth of new neurons in the hippocampus, and enhances the release of brain-derived neurotrophic factor, a protein that supports the survival and growth of neurons involved in memory formation. A brisk walk meets this threshold. The cognitive returns are measurable and well documented. You do not need to train for athletic performance. You need to move your body consistently enough to maintain the neurological environment that supports learning. For many of the professionals I work with, a 20-minute walk before their daily reading session serves double duty. It satisfies the exercise requirement, and, as we will see in Chapter 7, it also enhances creative thinking. The third is single-task focus during learning. When you read while checking notifications or listen to a lecture while composing an email, the information you are trying to encode never receives the attentional processing required for strong memory formation. No technique can compensate for information that your brain never fully registered. During your focused learning time, whether it is 30 minutes or an hour, put your phone in another room, close unrelated browser tabs, and direct your full attention to the material. This is not a personality preference or a productivity hack. It is a prerequisite for encoding to work. The difference in retention between focused and divided attention during initial learning is not marginal. It is the difference between information that enters long-term memory and information that never makes it past working memory at all. From storage to application. A well-trained memory transforms the practical value of everything else in this book. Your curiosity produces lasting knowledge rather than fleeting impressions. Your critical thinking draws on a reliable store of evidence and prior analysis, rather than on vague recollections and half-remembered claims. Your knowledge base remains accessible under pressure, in conversations and meetings, in decisions that demand real-time reasoning rather than the luxury of looking things up. Memory is not an isolated cognitive skill that exists apart from the rest of your intellectual life. It is the mechanism that connects every other method in this book to the situations where those methods matter. Without reliable memory, curiosity generates insights that disappear. Critical thinking produces conclusions that cannot be recalled when the next relevant situation arises. Knowledge sits in books you have read but can no longer access. With reliable memory, each method builds on the others cumulatively, each new piece of knowledge strengthening the network that supports the next, each retrieved insight becoming more firmly encoded for future use. Stored, retrievable knowledge is the raw material for the final and most practical intelligence skill: solving real problems. That is the subject of the next chapter, where every method we have built so far converges into action, where knowledge, analysis, and memory meet the messy, unpredictable demands of real decisions under real constraints. Chapter 6. Method 5. Improving problem-solving skills. A team lead named Sarah sits in a conference room with two options on the whiteboard. Her company's mobile app has a half-built notification feature. She can launch it in 3 weeks with reduced functionality, or delay by 2 months for the full version. Her director wants speed, her engineers want quality. Her customers have been requesting this feature for a year. She feels the pull to go with her gut, ship it now, fix it later. But instead she picks up a marker and writes a single sentence at the top of the board. We need to decide whether a limited launch serves the user well enough to justify the reputational risk of a partial feature. That sentence reframes the entire discussion. It is no longer about speed versus quality. It is about risk tolerance relative to user expectations. Sarah spends the next 40 minutes working through a structured process. She breaks the decision into its component parts: technical readiness, user impact, competitive timing, and support capacity. She generates 3 distinct approaches: launch with a beta label, delay fully, or launch to a subset of power users as a controlled test. She evaluates each against the problem she defined, selects the controlled test, and sets a review date 3 weeks after launch with specific success criteria: user engagement rate, error reports, and support ticket volume. The meeting ends with a clear plan and a built-in point at which the team will reassess. No intuition was required. What was required was method. This is where intelligence meets reality. The 4 methods covered in the preceding chapters, curiosity, critical thinking, knowledge building, and memory, develop the cognitive capacities that make good thinking possible. Problem solving is where those capacities are deployed against the messy, unpredictable, often ambiguous demands of actual decisions under actual constraints. It is the point where knowing and analyzing become selecting and executing a course of action under real conditions. Many people believe that effective problem solvers are born with some special kind of insight, a natural gift for seeing solutions that others miss. This belief is not supported by the evidence. Effective problem solving is overwhelmingly a learned skill. It depends on specific strategies and habits of mind that anyone can develop through practice. The difference between a skilled problem solver and a struggling one is usually not raw cognitive power. It is method, and method can be taught, practiced, and refined. The 4-step framework. Effective problem solving follows a structure. The steps are not always linear. Real problems often require moving back and forth between them, and that iteration is a feature of the process, not a failure of it. The framework consists of 4 stages: Define, decompose, generate, and test. Define. Write the problem in a single sentence that describes the gap between the current state and the desired state, without implying a solution. "We need to hire more people" is not a problem definition. It is a premature solution. "Our team cannot meet current project deadlines with existing capacity" is a definition. The discipline of writing one sentence forces you to confront what you actually know and what you are assuming. It also forces you to be specific about what would constitute success. If you cannot describe the gap, you cannot evaluate whether a proposed solution closes it. When this step is skipped, and it is the most frequently skipped step in the entire framework, people solve problems that don't exist, or more commonly, solve symptoms while the underlying cause continues to produce new symptoms. Sarah's instinct to frame the decision as speed versus quality would have led to a binary choice that missed the more nuanced question her one-sentence definition revealed. The 20 minutes she spent refining that sentence saved the team from a decision that would have been structurally flawed regardless of which option they chose. Decompose. Identify the 3 to 5 subproblems that make up the main problem. Almost no real-world problem is a single, indivisible unit. A revenue shortfall might decompose into declining customer retention, reduced average transaction size, and increased acquisition costs, each requiring a different intervention. A persistent conflict between two team members might decompose into misaligned role expectations, incompatible communication styles, and an unresolved disagreement about project priorities. When this step is skipped, people attempt to solve a complex, multi-part problem with a single action, and then feel confused when the action addresses one dimension but leaves the others untouched. The manager who responds to falling revenue by increasing advertising spend has addressed acquisition costs but has done nothing about retention or transaction size. If those are the primary drivers, the advertising spend is wasted. Decomposition prevents this by making the internal structure of the problem visible before any solutions are proposed. Generate. Produce at least 3 distinct solution directions before evaluating any of them. The emphasis on 3 is deliberate. Most people generate one idea, evaluate it immediately, and either accept it or reject it and generate one more. This sequential approach produces narrow solutions because each idea is evaluated in isolation rather than compared against alternatives. By forcing yourself to produce at least 3 options, including at least one that feels uncomfortable or unconventional, you expand the solution space and reduce the likelihood of anchoring on the first adequate idea. When this step is skipped, people default to the most familiar available response, regardless of whether it fits the specific problem they have defined. A manager whose previous team responded well to weekly check-ins will propose weekly check-ins for her current team, even if the current team's problem is entirely different from what the check-ins were designed to address. The generate step interrupts this pattern of defaulting by requiring you to look beyond the first solution that comes to mind. It is important to note that not all problems have optimal solutions. Some require selecting the least bad option under real constraints of time, money, information, and organizational politics. The generate step does not promise a perfect answer. It ensures that the answer you select has been compared against at least 2 alternatives, which consistently produces better outcomes than choosing the first plausible option. Test. Choose one option and implement it with a predefined review date and specific success criteria. "We'll try this and see how it goes" is not a test. "We will implement option B for 4 weeks and evaluate it against these 3 metrics on March 15th is a test. The difference is accountability. A test has a built-in mechanism for determining whether the solution is actually working. When this step is skipped, when a solution is implemented without a review mechanism, Failing approaches persist indefinitely because there is no built-in moment at which someone is required to ask whether they are working. Organizations are full of initiatives, processes, and policies that were implemented as experiments and became permanent by default, not because they succeeded, but because no one ever formally evaluated whether they did, solving the root cause, not the symptom. The single most frequent cause of problem-solving failure is acting on the visible symptom rather than the underlying cause. A department head notices that her team's error rate has doubled over the past quarter. The obvious response is to implement additional quality checks, more review stages, more oversight, more sign-offs. But if she applies the 5 Whys technique, originally developed by Cliche Toyota and systematized within Toyota's production system as a foundational tool of lean methodology, a different picture emerges. Why has the error rate increased? Because staff are rushing through tasks. Why are they rushing? Because the workload per person has increased significantly. Why has it increased? Because 2 experienced team members left and were not replaced. Why were they not replaced? Because a hiring freeze was imposed during a budget review. Why was the budget review extended? Because a senior leadership transition created a 3-month decision vacuum. The error rate is a symptom. The root cause is a staffing gap created by an organizational process failure. Additional quality checks would add burden to an already overstretched team, likely increasing frustration and turnover while doing nothing about the underlying capacity problem. The 5 Whys does not always produce a single clean root cause. Sometimes it reveals multiple contributing factors at different levels, but it reliably prevents the expensive mistake of treating symptoms as if they were causes. The technique takes 10 to 15 minutes, requires no special training, and can be applied to any problem where the obvious explanation feels too convenient or too surface level to be the whole story. The review loop. Good problem solving does not end with implementation. It includes a built-in mechanism for evaluating whether the chosen solution is actually working. This review loop has 3 components: a specific date on which the evaluation will happen, specific criteria that define success, and a genuine willingness to change course if the criteria are not met. The third component is the hardest. Once people have invested time, effort, and social capital in a solution, acknowledging that it isn't working feels like admitting failure. The result is a well-documented pattern in organizational and individual psychology: escalation of commitment. People continue investing in a failing approach precisely because they have already invested in it, hoping that additional effort will eventually vindicate the original decision. This pattern is remarkably resistant to self-awareness. Even people who know about escalation of commitment fall into it regularly, because the emotional cost of admitting failure is processed faster than the rational assessment of evidence. The antidote is structural, not motivational. By defining the review date and success criteria before implementation, as Sarah did in the opening scenario, you create a decision point that is harder to ignore or rationalize away. The question shifts from, should we give up, which feels like defeat, to, did we meet the criteria we set, which is an analytical question with a factual answer. This reframing does not eliminate the emotional difficulty of changing course, but it reduces it substantially by converting a judgment call into an evidence assessment. If no option produces the desired result, the review point becomes an opportunity to redefine the problem, decompose it differently, or generate new solutions with the benefit of what implementation has revealed. The framework is not a recipe for finding perfect answers. It is a process for converging on adequate ones and improving them over time through structured iteration. Adapting the framework to context. The same 4 steps apply in both familiar and unfamiliar domains, but the points of failure differ in predictable ways. Understanding these differences allows you to apply the framework more effectively across the full range of problems you encounter. In familiar domains, problems similar to ones you have solved before, the most common error is rushing the define step. Because the problem looks familiar, you pattern match to a previous situation and import a previous solution without checking whether the current problem is actually the same. A manager who successfully resolved a team conflict last year by restructuring roles assumes that the current conflict has the same cause and implements the same intervention without investigating whether the dynamics are different. Slowing down at define, writing the sentence, checking your assumptions, asking whether this situation genuinely matches the one you are remembering, prevents this premature convergence. In familiar territory, your experience is an asset, but only if you verify that it applies before deploying it. In unfamiliar domains, problems in areas where you have limited experience, the most common error is skipping the generate step. Lacking a repertoire of known solutions, people seize the first option that seems plausible and commit to it without considering alternatives. The anxiety of not knowing what to do creates pressure to act quickly, and that pressure narrows the solution space at precisely the moment when it most needs to be expanded. In unfamiliar territory, generating multiple options is not optional. It is the primary safeguard against acting on insufficient understanding. Force yourself to produce 3 possibilities even when, especially when, you feel uncertain. The uncertainty is evidence that you need more options, not fewer. From method to agility. The 5 methods presented across the preceding chapters, curiosity, critical thinking, knowledge building, memory, and problem solving, together form a complete cognitive toolkit. Each method targets a specific dimension of thinking, and each one strengthens the others. Curiosity generates the questions that drive learning. Critical thinking ensures that the answers are reliable. Knowledge provides the material for reasoning. Memory makes that material available when it is needed, and problem solving applies everything upstream to the decisions and challenges that actually face you. But cognitive tools, like any tools, can be wielded with varying degrees of speed, flexibility, and social effectiveness. A person can possess all 5 capabilities and still think slowly under pressure, miss creative solutions that lie outside their habitual patterns, or fail to benefit from the perspectives of people around them. The next chapter addresses exactly this: how to make the toolkit faster through creativity, more emotionally grounded through self-awareness, and more socially effective through the ability to learn from and reason with other people. Chapter 7. Methods that help improve and accelerate thinking. The 5 methods covered in the preceding chapters, curiosity, critical thinking, knowledge building, memory, and problem solving, build cognitive capacity. This chapter addresses something different: the conditions under which that capacity operates at its best. Creativity, emotional intelligence, and social intelligence are not additional methods. They are amplifiers. Each one increases the effectiveness of the methods you have already learned, and together they determine whether your cognitive toolkit remains rigid or becomes genuinely agile. A person can possess strong analytical skills, broad knowledge, reliable memory, and a structured approach to problem solving, and still underperform, because they cannot generate non-obvious solutions, because their emotions distort their reasoning under pressure, or because they fail to access the perspectives available in the people around them. This chapter addresses all 3 limitations. Creativity. A product development team I consulted with had spent 3 weeks analyzing a packaging design problem. They had the data. They had market research, material cost analyses, competitor benchmarking, and customer feedback surveys. They had applied structured problem-solving with rigor, and they were stuck. Every solution they generated was a variation on the same theme, incremental modifications to the existing design. When I sat in on their brainstorming session, the reason became clear within minutes. Every time someone proposed an idea, someone else immediately evaluated it. That won't work because the cost on that would be, we tried something like that in 2019. The team was operating entirely in evaluation mode. Their analytical tools were sharp. Their generative capacity was shut down. They had, without realizing it, made it socially impossible to suggest anything that wasn't already defensible, which meant they could only suggest things that were already familiar. This is a common pattern, and it has a neurological basis. Creative insight depends on associative thinking, the brain's ability to form connections between concepts that are not usually linked. This type of processing is associated with activation of the brain's default mode network, which becomes more active during states of relaxed, open-ended mental activity, and less active during focused, goal-directed cognition. When the prefrontal cortex, the brain region most involved in evaluation, planning, and self-monitoring, is highly engaged, associative processing is suppressed. This is why creative insights tend to arrive not during periods of intense concentration but during states of reduced cognitive control. On walks, in the shower, in the minutes before sleep. The mechanism is not fully understood, but the pattern is well established across multiple lines of research in cognitive neuroscience. The practical implication is not that focused thinking is bad. It is essential for analysis, evaluation, and implementation. The implication is that focused thinking and generative thinking require different cognitive states, and most people never deliberately create the conditions for the second one. The packaging team broke through their impasse only after I restructured their session. I asked them to spend 20 minutes generating ideas with a single rule. No evaluation of any kind until the 20 minutes were over. No, that won't work. No cost estimates. No references to past failures. Just ideas, written on sticky notes placed on the wall without discussion. In 20 minutes, they produced more distinct solution directions than they had in 3 weeks of analytical discussion. Not all of the ideas were good, but 2 of them were genuinely novel, and one, a modular packaging system that could be reconfigured for different product sizes without retooling, became the basis for the final design. 3 specific practices support creative thinking as a regular cognitive habit, not just an occasional breakthrough. First, dedicate 20 minutes each day to purely generative thinking. Set a timer. Write down ideas, questions, connections, or fragments related to a problem or project you are working on. The only rule is that nothing written down may be evaluated, criticized, or discarded during the 20 minutes. Judgment comes later, in a separate session. This practice is not free writing in the literary sense. It is targeted idea generation with the evaluative filter temporarily removed. Over time, it trains you to separate the generative and evaluative phases of thinking, which most people collapse into a single, self-defeating process. The separation is the key skill. Without it, your inner critic kills ideas before they have time to develop. Second, consume 1 piece of content per week from a field entirely outside your own. The same wildcard reading from Chapter 4, now applied with an explicit creative purpose. The goal is not to master the unfamiliar material, but to expose your brain to structural patterns, metaphors, and problem-solving approaches that differ from those in your primary domain. Research on analogical reasoning consistently shows that cross-domain exposure increases the range and novelty of solutions people generate for problems in their own field. 15 to 20 minutes of engaged reading is sufficient. The returns are not immediate, They accumulate over weeks and months as your brain builds a broader repertoire of structural templates to draw on when faced with novel challenges. Third, take a 15-minute walk before any session that requires creative output. A brainstorming meeting, a design session, a planning conversation. A 2014 study at Stanford by Opezzo and Schwartz found that walking increased participants' divergent thinking output by a significant margin compared to sitting, and that the effect persisted for a period after the walk ended. The mechanism appears to involve both mild physiological arousal and the reduction of self-monitoring that accompanies rhythmic physical movement. This is one of the lowest cost, highest return interventions available for creative thinking, and it pairs naturally with the exercise habit recommended in the memory chapter. Emotional intelligence. Emotional intelligence, as a scientific construct, was first systematically defined by Salovey and Mayer in 1990, well before it was popularized for a general audience. Its scientific status as a distinct type of intelligence remains debated. Researchers disagree on whether it constitutes a separate cognitive ability or a cluster of personality traits and learned behaviors. That debate, however, does not diminish the practical value of the core capability it describes: the ability to identify your own emotional state before it shapes a decision, and to recognize emotional states in others before responding to them. This is not a fixed personality trait. It is a learnable skill, and it has direct, measurable effects on the quality of your thinking. The mechanism is straightforward. Emotions function as a cognitive tax. When you are in a state of acute frustration, anxiety, or excitement, your decision-making accuracy drops, not because you become less intelligent, but because strong emotions narrow your attentional focus, reduce your working memory capacity, and increase your reliance on habitual responses rather than deliberate analysis. You default to patterns. You stop considering alternatives. You become more susceptible to exactly the cognitive biases that Chapter 3 was designed to help you manage: confirmation bias, anchoring, false binaries, because the emotional state reduces the cognitive resources available for overriding them. A senior project manager I worked with described a moment that made this vivid for him. He had received a critical email from a client at 4 p.m. on a Friday, felt a surge of defensiveness and anger, and immediately drafted a detailed, point-by-point rebuttal. He was about to send it when a colleague suggested he wait until Monday. He did. Reading his draft on Monday morning, he found it technically accurate, but so adversarial in tone that it would have damaged the relationship irreparably. His analysis was correct. His judgment, under the influence of anger, was not. The 10-minute delay, which became a 60-hour delay, saved him from a decision shaped entirely by the emotional state in which it was made. He now tells his team, "If the email makes you angry, it can wait until tomorrow. If it doesn't make you angry, it can still wait until tomorrow." Two practices build emotional intelligence as a cognitive skill rather than as a personality aspiration. First, the 10-minute rule. For any non-urgent decision, and the vast majority of decisions are non-urgent despite how they feel in the moment, impose a 10-minute buffer between the emotional trigger and the commitment. During those 10 minutes, do nothing related to the decision. Walk, get water, attend to an unrelated task. The purpose is not to suppress the emotion, but to allow the initial neurochemical surge to subside enough for deliberate reasoning to re-engage. Decisions made after a 10-minute delay in emotionally charged situations are measurably more accurate than decisions made in the acute moment. The practice is not about becoming emotionless. It is about ensuring that your emotions inform your thinking rather than override it. Second, emotion labeling. Before entering a conversation or making a decision in which you notice emotional activation, name the specific emotion you are experiencing. Not "I feel bad," but I feel anxious about being judged, or I feel resentful because I wasn't consulted. Research by Matthew Lieberman and colleagues at UCLA demonstrated that the act of labeling an emotion, putting a specific name to the feeling, reduces activation in the amygdala and increases activation in the prefrontal cortex. In plain language, naming what you feel shifts neural activity from the reactive system to the regulatory system. This is not a therapeutic exercise. It is a cognitive technique that takes 10 seconds and measurably improves the quality of thinking that follows. The more specific the label, the more effective the regulation. Anxious about being judged produces better results than simply nervous because it identifies both the emotion and its source, which gives your reasoning mind something specific to evaluate. Social intelligence. Social intelligence is commonly described as the ability to get along with people, which makes it sound like a personality quality rather than a cognitive tool. A more precise and useful definition is this: social intelligence is the ability to model another person's reasoning, to understand not just what they feel, but how they think, what assumptions they are operating from, and why their conclusions make sense from within their framework, even when those conclusions differ from yours. This matters for intellectual development, because collaboration with people who reason differently from you surfaces blind spots that self-reflection cannot reach. Your own thinking, no matter how disciplined, operates within a set of assumptions you cannot fully see because you are inside them. Another person, particularly one with different training, different experience, or different cognitive habits, can see what you cannot. Not because they are smarter, but because they are positioned differently. This is not a matter of social preference or interpersonal warmth. It is a matter of cognitive geometry. Two perspectives triangulate more accurately than one. Three perspectives more accurately than two. The value of diverse perspectives is not ideological. It is mathematical. A civil engineer I worked with experienced this during a cross-departmental project review. She had designed what she considered an optimal drainage solution for a commercial site. When a landscape architect on the team questioned her approach, not from an engineering perspective but from a user experience perspective, asking how pedestrians would actually navigate the site during heavy rain, the engineer initially dismissed the concern as outside the scope of her work. But the question exposed a genuine gap in her analysis. She had optimized for water flow without modeling human movement patterns. Incorporating the landscape architect's perspective produced a design that was both hydraulically effective and practically usable. The improvement came not from superior engineering knowledge, but from a reasoning framework the engineer did not possess, and she would never have accessed it if the conversation had not happened, or if she had dismissed the question rather than engaging with it. Two practices develop social intelligence as a cognitive tool rather than as a social skill. First, perspective articulation. Before disagreeing with someone in any professional context, articulate their position in your own words until they confirm that your statement accurately represents their view. This is not a politeness technique. It is a diagnostic one. If you cannot restate someone's reasoning to their satisfaction, you do not yet understand it well enough to evaluate it, and any disagreement you offer at that point is based on your model of their position, not on their actual position. The gap between the two is usually larger than you expect, and closing that gap before you respond consistently produces more productive disagreements and better outcomes for everyone involved. Second, structured information gathering. In any conversation where a decision is involved, ask two genuine questions before offering your own position. Not rhetorical questions, not leading questions. Questions aimed at understanding what the other person knows that you don't, or what they see that you haven't considered. This practice forces a shift from advocacy mode, where you are assembling arguments for your existing position, to inquiry mode, where you are actively seeking information that might change it. 2 questions, asked before you speak, consistently produce better informed positions than any amount of internal deliberation. They also signal to the other person that you are genuinely interested in their reasoning, which tends to make the conversation itself more productive and more honest. How the amplifiers connect. The relationship between the 3 amplifiers in this chapter and the 5 methods in chapters 2 through 6 is specific, not general. Each amplifier strengthens particular methods in particular ways. Creativity amplifies curiosity, the subject of Chapter 2, by transforming idle interest into novel questions and unexpected connections. It also amplifies problem-solving, Chapter 6, by expanding the range of solutions you can generate beyond the familiar and habitual. Without creativity, curiosity produces questions but not surprises, and problem-solving produces adequate responses but not innovative ones. Emotional intelligence amplifies critical thinking, Chapter 3, by reducing the influence of confirmation bias, defensiveness, and emotional reasoning on your analysis. The 10-minute rule and emotion labeling are, in effect, debiasing techniques applied at the neurological level. Without emotional regulation, critical thinking is compromised precisely when it is most needed, under pressure, in conflict, and in situations where you have a personal stake in the outcome. Social intelligence amplifies knowledge building, Chapter 4, by expanding the range of information sources available to you far beyond what any individual could access alone. Every person whose reasoning you can accurately model becomes, in effect, an additional lens through which you can examine problems. Without social intelligence, your knowledge base is limited to what you have personally read, studied, and experienced, a fraction of what is available through genuine engagement with people who think differently. Together, the 5 methods and 3 amplifiers form a complete, self-reinforcing system. The methods build capacity. The amplifiers optimize performance. Neither is sufficient without the other, and both respond to the same principle that has governed this entire book. Deliberate, consistent practice produces measurable cognitive improvement, regardless of where you start. The system is now complete. What remains is to put it into practice, which is the subject of the conclusion. Conclusion. It is 7 in the morning. A woman sits at her kitchen table with 43 notifications on her phone, 2 contradictory news alerts, and a decision to make before 10. But something is different now. Instead of scanning the headlines and reacting to whichever one triggers the strongest feeling, she pauses. She notices the anxiety, names it, lets the initial surge pass. She checks the source of each alert and identifies that one is based on a press release and the other on a peer-reviewed study. She chooses which to take seriously based on evidence, not emotion. She drafts a response to her colleague's email by writing the core problem in 1 sentence before proposing a solution. None of this takes longer than her old approach. It takes less time because she is no longer cycling through reactions, second-guessing, and starting over. One specific behavior has changed. She evaluates before she responds. Everything else follows from that. The complete system. This book has presented 5 methods and 3 amplifiers, and they function as an integrated system, not as a collection of independent techniques. Curiosity generates questions. It is the force that keeps the mind actively engaged with what it does not yet understand. Critical thinking filters the answers those questions produce, separating reliable conclusions from appealing but unsupported ones. Knowledge building provides the substantive material that both curiosity and critical thinking require in order to operate at depth. Without broad, structured knowledge, questions remain shallow, and analysis remains thin. Memory stores that material in a form that remains accessible under real conditions, in conversations, in meetings, in decisions made under time pressure, rather than letting it fade within days of being acquired. Problem solving applies everything upstream to the situations that actually demand action, defining what is wrong, decomposing it, generating options and testing solutions with built-in review. Creativity accelerates curiosity and problem solving by expanding the range of connections and solutions the mind can generate beyond the familiar and habitual. Emotional intelligence accelerates critical thinking by reducing the distorting influence of unexamined emotional states on analysis, ensuring that your reasoning is sharpest precisely when the pressure to react is highest. Social intelligence accelerates knowledge building by giving you access to reasoning frameworks, perspectives, and information that no individual could develop alone. Each amplifier makes one or more of the 5 methods measurably more effective, and all 8 elements reinforce one another through consistent practice. The first 30 days. Adopting the full system at once is neither necessary nor advisable. The methods are designed to be layered sequentially, each one establishing a foundation for the next. The following protocol represents a realistic starting point: 30 minutes per day, building 1 habit per week. In week 1, establish the question log from Chapter 2. Each evening, write down 3 things you encountered during the day that you did not fully understand. Do not research them yet. Simply train your attention to notice gaps in your understanding. At the end of the week, choose 1 question from the log and spend 15 minutes investigating it. Total daily investment: 3 minutes in the evening, plus 15 minutes once during the week. In week 2, add the 3-question checklist from Chapter 3. For any claim you encounter that provokes a strong reaction, agreement or disagreement, ask, what is the source? What is the evidence? What is the alternative explanation? Apply this once per day to 1 claim. Continue the question log from week 1. Total additional daily investment, 2 to 3 minutes. In week 3, begin the 3-tier reading system from Chapter 4. Choose 1 core text in your professional field and 1 wildcard article from an unrelated domain. Read for 30 minutes per day. Process each session using the 5-minute protocol. 3 summary sentences, 1 connection, 1 open question. Continue the question log and the 3-question checklist. Total additional daily investment: 35 minutes, replacing passive content consumption rather than adding to your schedule. In week 4, add spaced repetition from Chapter 5 for the material you read during week 3. Review key concepts after 1 day, 3 days, and 7 days. Use the retrieval practice method. Close the source, write what you remember, check the gaps. Continue all previous practices. Total additional daily investment: 5 to 10 minutes. By the end of this 30-day sequence, you will have established 4 daily and weekly habits that operate across the first 4 methods. Problem solving, Chapter 6, and the 3 amplifiers from Chapter 7 integrate naturally once the foundational practices are in place, because they draw on the same capacities the first 4 methods build. You do not need to schedule them separately. You will find yourself defining problems more precisely, generating solutions more broadly, and engaging with other people's reasoning more productively, because the underlying cognitive habits that support those activities are already in operation. What intelligence is? Intelligence is not a score. It is not a category you were assigned in school or a ceiling you were told you could not exceed. It is a set of behaviors performed consistently over time, asking 1 question per day instead of letting it pass. checking the source of a claim before accepting it, writing down what you learned before moving on to the next thing, pausing for 10 minutes before making a decision under emotional pressure. These behaviors are small, specific, and repeatable. They do not require exceptional ability. They require only the decision to practice them. And that decision, renewed daily, is what separates a mind that continues to develop from one that has stopped. A difficult conversation that ends in understanding rather than stalemate. A decision made with evidence rather than anxiety. A problem defined precisely enough to actually be solved. A connection between two ideas from different fields that produces a solution no one else had considered. These are the concrete outcomes of a mind that is trained, not merely talented, and training is available to anyone who begins. The first question is waiting. Thank you for listening until the very end. If you enjoyed this audiobook, support the video with a like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new releases.